This is a brief video lecture on the Coquette. I apologize for the noise. I'm in a room that has a big echo in it. And I'm going to be talking today about conduct and early American fiction to follow up on some other things we've been talking about recently in our class. When I did some research on early American conduct books, I found this volume called Learning How to Behave, a historical study of American etiquette books, and it turns out to be the first full-length study of conduct books. And you'll see why in a few minutes there's a relationship between these conduct books and the novel. But I was able to buy a used copy of this on Amazon for $20 during this process of making the PowerPoint and video lecture of all things. But I wanted to delve into this and talk about where it's gone and how the conduct book relates to the Coquette. The conduct book was a genre that began in early America. It was not unique to America, but also occurred in Europe as a genre. These conduct books helped men and women, young men and young women, learn how to behave and were, of course, written by older men and older women. In 1994, Sarah Newton did a follow-up on learning how to behave, and she collected a study of conduct books throughout history if you're interested in pursuing this on your own for any future projects that you might have. I want to read a few titles and sample through those for you really quickly. And so I'll begin with a quote from the Newton book before doing that. Newton said, "A conduct book is a text that is intended for an inexperienced young adult or other youthful reader that defines an ethical, Christian-based code of behavior and that normally involves gender role definitions." So that last bit on gender role definitions is, of course, where we get such a strong connection to the course and to this book. Here are a few titles. By Marie Astel, we have A Serious Proposal for the Ladies for the Advancement of Their Interest, 1701. From 1726, Daniel Defoe, you may know his name, wrote, Some Considerations upon Street Walks with a Proposal for Lessening the Present Number of Them. In other words, reducing the number of prostitutes. 1736, we have The Female Rake, or Modern Fine Lady, from Joseph Dorman. We have An Inquiry into the Duties of the Female Sex, 4th edition, 1799, from Thomas Gisborne. The Importance of the Female Sex with Observation of Their Manners, from 1803. And many, many more. A lot of these turn out to be advice from women to their daughters or even men to their sons. And if you're interested in following up on this, I'd suggest this Armstrong reference that you have on the screen. That's also a wonderful reference for this study. At the heart of conduct books, again, we have the gender bifurcation that we've talked about in class, the easy splitting into men and women's considerations and concerns. With the Coquette, we're looking at femininity. And in a book called, well, conveniently, Femininity, there are three aspects of femininity that I'd like to highlight. Socioeconomic aspects of femininity. Women as markers of the middle class and women as writers. Just three basic parameters for looking at femininity, not only from the time period we're looking at, but I think it fits what we're looking at today as well when we're making connections. I also wanted to bring in gender essentialism as a term, and I did a quick little spin online for a definition I liked, and I pulled one from a blog. You can grab the citation in the version of the PowerPoint that you can access that's not part of this video presentation. But the idea that there's a uniquely feminine and uniquely masculine essence that exist independently of cultural conditioning, Both actual minor and alleged major differences between the sexes have been used to justify inequities and constraints which harm women emotionally, financially, and physically. And I'd like to add to this definition, they harm men as well. I couldn't resist. A lot of the time, discussions and arguments about fashion relate to the concept of gender roles and proper conduct. And I selected a quote from a conduct manual, a letter of genteel and moral advice to a young lady. So you can pause and read this. I also didn't want to leave men out of the list. I don't have as much material on it because it doesn't relate as strongly to the Coquette, but I did want to read a few titles of conduct books for men. Familiar letters to young men on various subjects, designed as a companion to the young man's guide. That's from 1850. Hopes and help for the young of both sexes, relating to the formation of character, choice of avocation, health, amusement, music, conversation, cultivation of intellect, moral sentiment, social affection, courtship, and marriage. That's from 1854. Lectures to Young Men, 1854. The American Citizen, and there we have the American Citizen angle we've been talking about. His rights and duties, according to the spirit of the Constitution of the United States. That was 1857. Advice to a Young Gentleman on Entering Society, 1839. And here's one that relates fairly directly to the American Dream. It's a title from, let's see if I have a date on this. It looks like I have the dates of the author's life. Henry Howe, 1816 to 1893. So my guess is it's probably mid-century, 1850-ish. Adventures and Achievements of Americans, a series of narratives illustrating their heroism, self-reliance, genius, and enterprise. And that has a connection, of course, to men's conduct and success in America and the acquisition of what we call the American Dream. We've been talking about Chesterfieldianism, and I did want to include this slide just because I was able to discover in a quick web tour once again that the book is currently being published if you are interested in it. I also wanted to include a couple of facts and stats that I thought were fascinating. The first is that 30% of births in post-revolutionary American of a first child was less than 9 months after marriage. That was funny. So in other words, 30% of children born after the American Revolutionary War were conceived before marriage. Also, women's fertility rates fell almost 25% during this period, in which women's literacy rates almost doubled. So here we might even imagine the novel as a form of birth control. It's kind of a funny twist on literacy, and one that I think makes a lot of sense. I included this slide from one of my favorite movies. It's E.M. Forster's novel, A Room with a View, which captures the end of the Victorian era. It's a lovely film if you haven't seen it. Wise and Foolish Virgins. I'm going to pop the PDF online for your access. It's a wonderful article that makes a direct connection between conduct novels and conduct manuals. And I want to take a look here at a few things. First, I'm going to read a little poem to you by Susanna Rosen. She was a woman who wrote a number of popular books and plays in early America. Here's your poem. Ah, lovely maid, too soon you'll find your happiest days are left behind. To grief and sorrow we were born. Each flower we see conceals a thorn. Though life is an uneven road, and though uncertain our abode, within this fragile house of clay, yet there are means to smooth the way. From my experience dearly bought, blush not, my Anna, to be taught. And that was Susanna Rosen's verses addressed to a young lady on her leaving school. So this idea of freedom or not is one that it produces some amount of tension in the conduct enterprise and novels, freedom or not. Well, to a certain extent, Marriageable girls had some freedom of choice of husbands in this time period, a little bit more than in the earlier time periods in America. But it's a very limited sort of freedom within what marriage actually meant. This view into the marriage enterprise, as I'm going to call it, is something that we talked about as vicarious enjoyment or reading somebody else's life to experience something that you can't have in your own. What fiction did was it spoke privately to a reader. Kathy Davidson calls this the ability to be a femme covert or hidden woman by legal status is something that women experienced in their daily lives. They were hidden by law. They couldn't own property. But there's a little bit of a dual meaning here because there can be the hidden woman as the reader reading about a life she can never have. So this idea of a femme covert has a nice double meaning in what we're looking at here. The reader can be present at a conversation and imaginatively part of something that she's not there. Something else of interest that I thought I'd bring up is natural weakness. I should put quotation marks around natural, but the idea that conduct books were going for was to correct some sort of perceived natural weakness in women. A love of fashion, frivolity, immodesty, flirtatiousness. These were considered natural weaknesses of women. And the word natural here is so important because it relates back to the idea of studying the world to figure out what is natural, what is right, what is moral, the ideals of the Enlightenment here. Natural weakness is something that people would have believed women possessed through observation of behavior. So we have the concept of wise and foolish virgins. And I'm going to quote now from the article of that same title. It's about the threats women faced. Threats are especially true for unmarried women. Those who are presented in both female conduct books and hybrid conduct fiction as either the wise or foolish virgin. The wise virgin conforms and is safe and happy. The foolish virgin disobeys and is miserable and punished severely. This obedience, happiness versus disobedience, misery formula becomes a kind of natural law in conduct literature. And I put this image from A Broom with the View because I see this so much also figured in Victorian literature. You see this very much living on in your Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy, Bronte enterprise. A little bit more on conduct books to extend this. Conduct books specifically dramatize the possible limits of women's behavior. It was the novel as a conduct book too, the conduct book as a novel. So they're working along some sort of edge. So you could see novels as hybrid text. You could see them as serving in loco parentis, in other words, in the place of a parent, looking over the conduct that a child should conform to. And in all of this, there's a great paradox that I want to highlight. For women in particular, passivity leads to power. With the formula for women at the time, through self-discipline and passivity lies power. This is something that you can read much more about if you are interested in this in the Wise and Foolish Virgins article that I'll be posting to Blackboard. I want to return a little bit more specifically to the Coquette to begin to wrap things up. With the history of the Coquette, I'll tell you that readers would have already known the story. It was very popular. There was a play called The New England Coquette in 1802 that followed up on the actual events from real life. The Elizabeth Whitman or Eliza Wharton story was published widely in newspapers and would have been very well known. It presented object lessons, the young woman as an object. And with all of this, you have the author dealing with the question, well, how does an author write a novel about a person to whom little actually happens, but a love story is supposed to happen? So, how do you package all of this as entertainment when you have real history involved? You're trying to get at an overarching concept of what are the options for women? How do we present this in such a way that women might learn some lessons from this? Object lessons. Real life examples, the object, used to teach a moral principle. And with the Coquette, we have the object lessons meets soap opera, one filled with a number of archetypes, just to wrap this around to what we've already been talking about in class. This idea of object lessons lives on often in church teachings, which is why I have that image there. I do want to say one thing about the characters that we didn't talk about in class. They function like a Greek chorus. You have roles by the characters that you see listed here on this slide. And I just want to bring back the idea of performance and maybe how, because novel writing was undeveloped, there's some difficulty telling at times who said what and who wrote, theoretically anyway, which letters. So her chorus of friends, they're like a Republican chorus. We have 9 authors, 74 letters, and never a physical description of any of the characters. So here's the last slide. I'm going to wrap things up for now and for history and pull a little bit from history. If you go on Wikipedia, you'll actually see a gravestone of the real Elizabeth Whitman. It's a replacement because the first gravestone was so worn down by people visiting it, mostly women, going to express their sympathy and sadness for what had happened to her. There's a few other things on this slide that probably caught your attention right away. In some of my indexing or searching online for images, I found this when I looked up conduct books. I thought that was fascinating and an interesting thing to contemplate with today's discussions of conduct. Where are today's discussions of conduct? Where do we find them? We still look at women's dress and behavior much more than we look at men, but we also, in our society, tend to target people that are considered different. Here we go back to the other that we talked about in class, and therefore I put this title on for you to see. I'm also going to jump out of the PowerPoint to end this. I'm going to hop out of here really quickly and let's just see how well I can manage this on my new machine. All right, so what you're not seeing is the tabs at the top. I can see that's not captured here, but this is when I was inside the blog that I discovered, the Finally Feminism blog. I'm going to exit out of that one. Here I have this is a PDF that I pulled off of the Early American Newspapers database, and I'm going to read from right here where you see me swirling. Last Friday, a female stranger died at the Bell Tavern in Danvers, and on Sunday her remains were decently interred. The circumstances relative to this woman are such as excite curiosity and interest our feelings. She was brought to the Bell in a chaise from Watertown, as she said, by a young man whom she had engaged for that purpose. After she had alighted and taken a trunk with her into the house, the chaise immediately drove off. She remained at the inn until her death in expectation of the arrival of her husband, whom she expected to come for her, and appeared anxious at his delay. She was averse to being interrogated concerning herself or connections, etc. And down here it says her linen was marked E.W. So this is from the real Elizabeth Whitman. And then it says, here's the super scandalous part, she was brought to bed of a lifeless child. So she died, and so did the baby. And then you see it goes on for some amount of time about, and then it ends up switching topics. So that's one early newspaper account. Here is another. There are many more, but I found these by going into the Early American database, America's Historical Newspapers, that I showed you in class. You can search for terms and find a number of things there that might interest you. Another thing I want to show you is there's a couple of good websites. Conduct Books and Advice Manuals in America will lead you at this one, located at Assumption I think it's Assumption College. Let me back up one step here. Assumption College, yes, you'll see that here. At the University of Michigan, they have a large collection in their archives that they also represent online in the Making of America books on conduct of life as a subject. Also, weirdly, or maybe not, when I was searching this, I came up with this interesting history of birth control, which I think makes a lot of sense as another trajectory that we can use to get into where we are now. And last but not least, at the books and special collections rare books at the new university, you have a collection, True Womanhood, Piety, Purity, Submissiveness, and Domesticity, which is something we're going to follow up on later during this semester. Thank you, and I will see you next Monday.